Good morning. I am Jordan McNary with the Carter Center. I work on our U.S. elections project with a particular focus around accessibility and a few other things, of course. I want to thank you so much for attending our three-part workshop today. Um, we will be posting the recording of this video to our YouTube by Thursday. It will include the CART captioning as well as the ASL interpretation. If you experience any technical issues with the ASL interpretation or the CART captioning, please email me at jordan.mcnary@cartercenter.org. You should be able to view the CART captioning by clicking on captions in the bottom toolbar, and also the interpretation by clicking on interpretation in the bottom toolbar. Again, if you have any difficulties, please shoot me an email and I will get back to you quickly. Thank you again so much for attending, and I am going to pass it on to Sarah to give you guys a nice introduction of the purpose of our workshop, as well as an introduction to our first session. Thank you.
Am I on screen? There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Disability Voting Rights Week. 33 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act, disabled people still do not have equal and full access to the voting process in the United States. We know that there's still a voter turnout gap of about 1.5% for disabled voters in the 2022 elections. And we have been looking at, as a country, accessibility of polling places for quite a while. The U.S. Government Accountability Office in 2016 did a survey finding that only 17% of polling places that they surveyed were fully accessible. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about polling place accessibility audits and how they can help us to understand the current state of accessibility in polling places and how we can elevate those issues to election officials to make our voting process more accessible. These audits provide advocates and disabled voters with the documentation they need to back up years of lived experience with access barriers in the polling place. They also provide election officials with the data to understand the extent of inaccessibility in their jurisdictions and to begin to fix those issues. Our partner, Detroit Disability Power, has been conducting polling place accessibility audits for several years and has been a leader in using these audits to understand the barriers and advocate for change. During the 2022 election, Detroit Disability Power and the Carter Center partnered to expand this survey, deploying 21 volunteers over 261 polling locations across the Detroit metro area. The Carter Center was able to bring its vast experience with nonpartisan election observation worldwide to support the already fantastic work that DDP has been doing for years in the community and as subject matter experts on accessibility. Today, we will first hear from Dessa Cosma and Kenya Flores about the 2022 audit, its findings, and their recommendations for what election officials can do to address the issues uncovered in the polling place audit in 2022. Then we'll hear from election officials about how they approach accessibility of polling places and the best practices for ensuring that disabled voters have equal access to the voting process. Finally, we'll go over our methodology from the 2022 survey to share how we prepared for and conducted this audit and talk about how this type of nonpartisan observation and polling place accessibility audit can be replicated elsewhere in the country. And with that, I will hand it over to Dessa and Kenya, who will be leading our first workshop today.
Fantastic. This is Dessa. Thank you so much, Sarah and Jordan, and thank you all for joining us today. It's been my pleasure to be working with the Carter Center for the last year or so on these projects, and it's great to be able to share that with our audience this afternoon. I am Dessa Cosma. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the founding executive director of Detroit Disability Power. With me today is my colleague, Kenya, who will introduce herself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kenya Flores, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Voting Access and Election Protection Fellow at DDP.
Thank you. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I want to quickly tell you a little bit about Detroit Disability Power so you know who we are and what we're all about. We are a disability-focused social justice organization working to dismantle systems of oppression and build political power. And we do this in a variety of ways, with a large focus actually on civic engagement and voting rights in particular. We also offer a lot of anti-oppression trainings with an anti-ableism focus. We do programming here in the Detroit and Metro Detroit community. And we do also run a fee-for-service accessibility consulting program that helps organizations, businesses, and governments get with the program on creating a world that works for people with a variety of disabilities. So if you're interested in any of the work that we do or you want to continue to connect, please check us out at our website, detroitdisabilitypower.org. Next slide, please. In our short time that we have together today, we're going to be talking about the process and the report of what Sarah mentioned of our audit work last year. And that report was called Improving Voting Accessibility for Detroit Voters with Disabilities. So in the time today, we're going to share a little bit about the process and the results of our 2022 audit with the Carter Center. We're going to hopefully answer some questions for you all and share some recommendations for creating better access in the 2024 election and moving forward forever. And also explore ways to collaborate. We think that this is a all hands on deck kind of situation. And so any way that you want to get in to make the process of democracy more accessible for people with disabilities, we welcome your ideas and your efforts. First, we are going to give a little bit of background and purpose of the audits, a little history and methodology, although we're leaving a bulk of the methodology for the third part of today's agenda with Sarah and Leah. We're going to talk a little bit about the data that we gathered here in Detroit in 2022 through those audits. We're going to share some recommendations based on the data that we collected, and then we'll have some time at the end for some discussion and questions and idea sharing. So if that's interesting to you, you are in the right place. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So back in 2018, Detroit Disability Power did our first polling access audit. And it actually happened because that August in the primary, I went to vote. I'm a wheelchair user. I went to vote and there was nowhere for me to vote in my wheelchair. There was nothing that I could actually reach to fill out my ballot. And when I talked to the poll workers about this, they seemed kind of at a loss. They definitely were not prepared for my presence. And they did a little makeshift solution that didn't feel super empowering to me, and also was not something that I felt confident that they would plan for in the future. I just so happened that evening to have a meeting with my organizational advisory council, all of whom are people with a variety of disabilities. And when I shared my experience, every one of them had had a similar but slightly different problem voting at some point in their adult life because of their disability and because of the lack of preparedness where they had gone to vote. And that's when it really clicked for me that this is not a DESA problem. This is not, a here and there problem. This is actually a system-wide, widespread problem that really needed some attention focused on it. So that year for the general election, Detroit Disability Power collaborated with Warriors on Wheels and the Greater Detroit Agency for the Blind and Visually Impaired to survey polling locations across the Metro Detroit area. We did this with volunteers and some Google forms, and we actually did it for the next 3 election cycles because we had a municipal election in there as well. And so on the screen now is actually a map that we made of some of the polling sites that we went to, had our volunteers go to, and some of the negative experiences they had with voting access. There is a quote here I'll read that says, "The main door to the building had a wheelchair accessible button, but was blocked with orange cones and a construction barrel." So you can see technically the building was accessible, but it was definitely not accessible on election day. And I actually don't know what happened with that voter. Did that voter get someone to bring a ballot out? Did that voter go home frustrated? Did they end up even being able to cast their vote? I don't know. The other comments here are about not having wheelchair height voting booths, or someone not being able to use the accessible voting machine because the poll worker didn't know how to use it. These are common things that we hear from voters all the time. So starting in 2018, we started being able to collect this data. If you could go to the next slide, please. Here's a map from the following year, similar comments. So no accessible entrance, the accessible voting machine not being functional, poll workers not being particularly trained about how to work with disabled voters coming in to cast their ballot. And so each year we would collect this data and we would make a map and we would put some quotes together and we would share it with the clerks for the jurisdictions that we had visited as an organizing tool to help them learn and to help us be able to pressure them to do better. What we learned really was that the problems were quite widespread and varied, but what we also concluded was that they were highly solvable problems, and that's the good news here. So in 2022, as was mentioned earlier, Detroit Disability Power was fortunate to partner with the Carter Center to take these surveys to scale. We made the questions more uniform and based on proper data collection methods. We found a lot more people to systematically go from polling place to polling place across the metro area. And Kenny is going to talk more about this in a moment. And that is how we were able to collect such a large amount of data in 2022. So before I hand it over to Kenny to talk about that, I just want to get us all on the same page about a basic fact. It's really important that we know that laws are in place to ensure disabled voters' rights are protected, and that the problems that we see and that we're going to be discussing over this time together are not mere hiccups or inconvenience. They are actually barriers to voting, and they are also, frankly, breaking the law. So there are laws to protect disabled voters. If we could go to the next slide, please. And when we find these problems, they are examples of the law not being upheld to its full potential. So, minimal accessibility requirements of sites used to cast ballots during federal elections are defined in the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Help America Vote Act. And in every state, there are state laws that bolster these federal laws and provide mechanism for filing complaints. So this is actually quite serious. It has an impact on voter turnout, but it's also about living up to the standard of the law. With that, I'm going to hand it to Kenya to talk a little bit about what we did in 2022.
Thank you, Dessa. So DDP and TCC coordinated 261 audits on Election Day in 2022. We recruited, trained, and deployed 21 volunteers to conduct the audits. These audits take place in jurisdictions that include diverse demographic characteristics. Next slide, please. The audits take place in 15 cities in the 3 core counties of Metro Detroit, which include Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb. Next slide, please. On Election Day, volunteer observers visited 98% of the polling places in the observation zone, including all locations in 12 of the 15 jurisdictions. The volunteers completed a checklist designed by DDP and TCC to evaluate the interior and exterior of each location. The observation team assessed whether each site had an accessible parking area with a clear pathway into the building, an accessible entrance, a fully accessible voter assist terminal, also known as the VAT, and a seated height booth for casting paper ballots privately. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dessa to talk a little bit about our data and our findings.
Thank you. If this is Dessa, if we could go to the next slide, please. And one more, please. Great, thank you. So of the 261 polling locations that we audited in a single day, and I will tell you that's quite the lift, only 16% passed all 4 categories of accessibility required by law. So if you remember what Sarah said earlier about a previous national survey, this is really similar results. And given that all of the features identified in what Kenya just shared, so accessible parking, accessible path of travel to the building, a fully accessible voting machine, and wheelchair height voting booths, those 4 categories, given that all 4 of those are essential for creating a holistic, totally accessible, equitable polling site, only polling locations that met all 4 of those were considered fully accessible, which accounts for why the percentage of fully accessible ones are so low. Some polling sites did well in some areas, but not in all 4, and therefore they did not get a passing score. If we can go to the next slide, please. On the screen now is actually a snapshot of the checklist and questions that we were asking when we went to each of these 261 locations. So we're happy to send out a copy of this so you can read it more fully, but just to hit the highlights right now. In terms of a fully accessible parking and pathway, we were asking if they had accessible parking spots. We were making sure that the path from the parking lot into the place where the voting happened was passable by a wheelchair or someone using a white cane. We also were checking the quality of the entrance. Were there stairs with no corresponding ramp or lift? Was the door wide enough? Was the door passable? Was the door unlocked? Did somebody have to go all the way around the building with no signage to find an accessible entrance that maybe wasn't the main entrance other voters were using? Then the next category was around the accessible voting machine, which here in Michigan is called a voter assist terminal or a VAT. We were checking to see if the voting machine was set up, if it was at a good height, if it was powered on, if it had all of its equipment, if the headphones were plugged in, and if it was oriented to protect a voter's privacy. So one of the things that we saw was a voter assist machine facing the wall, for example, right next to where people come to get their ballot, meaning that every single person that walked by after getting their ballot could see who someone was voting for. So it wasn't private or secret like it should be. And then finally, we were also checking for fully accessible voting booths for those who chose to use a paper ballot. And that would be someone like me who comes in a wheelchair, wants to fill out a paper ballot, but can't use a standing height voting booth to do so. And so these were the categories, these are the questions we were asking. And again, only 16% of polling locations that we visited on election day in 2022 met all 4 standards. If we could go to the next slide, please. On this slide is a summary of the 4 accessibility measures. I just want to make a note that the bottom row is not an addition or percentage of the 3 rows above. So at first, when you look at this, it can be a little confusing, but just to quickly review, of all the places we visited, 60% had accessible parking and a clear path of travel. 44% had accessible entrances. 56% had a workable, accessible voting machine, and 60% had an accessible voting booth. So you can see here that none of these numbers are over 60%, which is pretty troubling. And that means we have a lot of work to go. And when you think about, of all the 261 polling locations that we went to, only 16% had a yes in all 4 categories. So again, long way to go. I want to quickly run through, while we're still here on this slide, I want to quickly run through a little bit more about what each of these categories meant. So as I said, technically a majority of places did have accessible parking and a clear pathway, but really not by that much. 40% did not, and that's pretty troubling. When it comes to accessible entrances, this was one of the most prevalent impediments for voters with disabilities. And many entrances, the main entrance to the voting site was not apparent. And that basically means that maybe it was a side door or was around a corner, there wasn't good signage. At 32 polling sites we went to that day, entrances had stairs, period. So someone like me in a wheelchair would get there and not be able to enter. And then when we're talking about the voter assist terminals, they were really inconsistent is what we found. So most of the polling locations had them on site, which is of course required by federal law, but they weren't set up properly. They weren't in working order. So a lot of them displayed error codes that staff didn't know how to fix. 12% of them didn't have headphones or the necessary additional equipment for some people to use to maneuver or operate the machine. And some were out of printing paper. So there were a variety of reasons that these machines were present, but not really functional. And 38 of the VATs were set up in a way that didn't ensure privacy, even though everything else about them was functional. And then finally, in the category of accessible, or what I call wheelchair height voting booths, Most of the sites we went to didn't have these set up at all. Sometimes they could be set up upon request, but that's not really how voting should work. And so this lack of accessible or wheelchair height voting booths was another main problem that we saw in our observation. So a couple of important facts to think about as we're trying to problem solve. So that's all the bad news. That's the reality on the ground. And none of that was surprising to us, frankly, after having done this for several years on a smaller scale. Although having the data is really critical. Like I said, 16% met all accessibility measures, which is pretty abysmal. However, if you take a little step back and look at the data more closely, 67 polling locations, or 26% of all of the ones observed, scored no in only one of the 4 categories that we measured. Meaning that if those places, those specific polling sites, remedied the one thing that they didn't do well last election day, it would raise the number of fully accessible polling places to 42%. So am I satisfied with 42%? Absolutely not. However, is 42% much better than 16%? Yes. And would 42% accessibility mean that more disabled voters had a accessible, successful experience voting? Absolutely. And so that's a place where we can dig in and make some improvements kind of in a concentrated way to make a pretty big improvement overall. So this information, combined with the knowledge that many access barriers are game day decisions that are easily remedied with low cost or no cost intentionality, things like making sure the VAT is plugged in and turned on, means that we can fairly easily make significant improvements to voter accessibility. So this is great news. This means that not everything is a huge lift. This means that not everything costs a lot of money. It's just about some planning, some training, and some intentionality on election day. And I'm going to hand it over to Kenny to talk a little more about recommendations specific to what we found last November.
Thank you, Dessa. So as you mentioned, these results are pretty abysmal, and people with disabilities are unable to participate equitably in our democratic process. The recommendations we are going to outline are either low cost or free and easily implemented, but will drastically improve the lives of disabled people. We are committed to this work, but we cannot do this alone. We're going to outline some of the recommendations that, if implemented, will drastically improve the lives of disabled voters. We recommend establishing processes for coordination, liaison, and reporting. So coordinating with the jurisdiction's ADA coordinator to evaluate existing and potential polling place facilities for current accessibility and any improvements that might be needed. So these would be temporary modifications. Designating a primary contact person for election-related accessibility topics and facilitate contact for election officials and voters to reach them. This point person should be responsible for confirming accessibility in advance and responding to challenges, especially on election day and during early and absentee voting. Implementing systematic, widespread reporting on the accessibility of polling locations. This reporting should be incorporated into the election day process of poll workers whose responses are incorporated into the post-election reporting process of clerks. Reports should go to the Secretary of State and be available on a web portal for public review. This also would facilitate additional research into the relationship between race, polling place accessibility, and the population's prevalence of disability. Now, in regards to training, clerks in each jurisdiction determine how prepared their poll workers are. Training should address poll worker understanding of accessibility accommodations, the proper placement and operation of accessibility voting equipment, and the rights and responsibilities of poll challengers. Additionally, training should also include a practice selection to ensure that poll workers understand how to operate the VAT. Next slide, please. In regards to exterior accessibility, we recommend having a clear, marked, accessible path of travel throughout each polling place and consistent signage, especially if not using the main entrance. Coordinating with facility owners in advance to ensure that the appropriate entries are unlocked. Doors should not be propped open unless there is no alternative. When propping open a door is unavoidable, ensure that the object used does not obstruct the doorway. Wheelchair users and individuals with other mobility aids must be able to get in and out. As far as interior accessibility goes, we recommend providing an accessible seat height voting booth for marking paper ballots and a movable chair. Ensuring that VATs and accessible voting booths are placed to ensure the voter can cast a ballot privately and independently. Next slide, please. So while this is a problem in Metro Detroit, it is not solely a local problem. Data collected around the country shows similar lack of prioritization of accessibility and negative consequences for disabled voters. In 2016, data showed that 60% of polling locations in the US had some sort of access barrier. Next slide, please. In 2020, 1 in 9 disabled voters reported challenges voting more than twice that of non-disabled voters. If people with disabilities voted at the same rate as non-disabled people, that would be 1.75 million more voters in the US. Although we are a sizable part of the electorate, we are often left behind. We should have a voice in who represents us on a local, state, and federal level. If we cannot equitably access the ballot, we don't get a fair chance at voicing our priorities and opinions about our communities and those who represent our interests. Every issue is a disability issue, and we need to be able to engage in democracy in order to increase the quality of life for the disability community. The problems we've highlighted through this report are not unsolvable problems. In fact, they are very fixable. Fixing them would have a huge impact on millions of people's ability to engage in our democracy and ultimately how well we are represented in our government. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dessa and Sarah for a Q&A.
Thank you. This is Dessa. If we could go to the next slide, please. I just want to uplift a resource that you might be interested in if these topics are relevant to you. Last year, we put out a book called The A to Z of Effective Inclusive Campaigns. And this is a 324-page guidance on how to design and implement issue and electoral campaigns that work for disabled volunteers, staff, and voters, and that win. So, this is relevant in a bigger picture sense, but there is a full chapter in this book about poll site access best practices. So you can learn more at inclusivecampaigns.org and get a copy there if that's interesting to you. And if we can go to the next slide, please. A couple of things just coming around the bend before we open this up for questions and answers for the rest of our time. On September 25th from 3:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern, we are doing a workshop about how to replicate these poll access audits in your community. And so it'll be some of the people you're seeing here today and some others really getting into the nitty-gritty of how to do what we did here in Detroit, where you live. And so we're going to be providing a lot of tools and resources and advice so that you don't have to recreate the wheel and do everything from scratch, but really can learn from our learnings over the last years. So here in Detroit, now that we've got this great data that Kenny and I just talked to you all about, and we've got these recommendations that she just went through, our job is really to continue working with local election officials to improve accessibility now and into the future. So we've been having a lot of meetings with clerks and others who are interested in voting rights, really strategizing how to turn these recommendations into reality. And we're working with all sorts of voting rights activists and organizers to integrate accessibility into the voting rights work that they're already doing. One of the things that we've seen over the years, as social justice or nonprofit organizations work on voting rights, is that they kind of forget about the accessibility piece. And there's a bit of a myth in general that because there are laws protecting disabled people, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, that everything is fine. But in actuality, everything is not fine. As we've shown you today, we have a lot of room for improvement, and laws have to be enforced to be helpful. So, really educating other voting rights activists and organizers around the accessibility piece of voting rights is something that we're really focused on doing. And then we will do these audits again in 2024. It's a major election here in Michigan and across the country, of course. And so we'll be replicating the audits. We'll hopefully be seeing some better results after this organizing and working with clerks and other election officials that I just mentioned. And like I said, we'll be working with other organizations to replicate these audits in their communities. So we're going to take it to scale even more. And we invite you to be a part of that in whichever way makes sense for you, no matter what community you're in. Whether you're disabled or not, you can absolutely be a part of making elections more accessible for disabled voters. So with that, we are here for some Q&A for the next 15 or 20 minutes.
Great. This is Sarah waiting to be put on the screen here. There we go. So we have a couple Q&A. So going to start with this one. Were any polling location audits conducted on communities in communities on the west side of Wayne County?
Yes, this is Dessa. I'm pulling up the full list of jurisdictions now. It's going to take me just a second, though. I can read those out in a moment. Sorry, it's taking me a minute, Sarah, so if you want to go to another question, that might be a good idea.
Apologies, I did not realize I was on mute. Yes, so has this information been shared with the Secretary of State and clerks?
This is Dessa. Yes, we've had some very good meetings with the Michigan Department of State and Bureau of Elections. They are eager to take our recommendations and recommend them to local clerks. The way that elections are administered in Michigan is in a very decentralized fashion. And so it's really up to clerks to implement the recommendations, although the Secretary of State and Michigan Department of State can provide training and resources and materials to help the clerks do the best that they can do. And I do have the full list of cities here now. I'm just going to read them real quickly for anybody who's from the Michigan, who knows Michigan. They are in 3 counties, as was said, Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne, which are the main 3 counties of Metro Detroit. So we audited Centerline, Dearborn, Detroit, Ecorse, Grosse Pointe Farms, Grosse Pointe Park, Grosse Pointe Shores, and Grosse Pointe Woods, as well as Hamtramck, Harper Woods, Highland Park, River Rouge, Southfield, and Warren. So that's 15 different jurisdictions.
Great, thank you. Going to read one that was submitted ahead of time. It's my first time working as a poll worker. How can I make a difference from an accessibility standpoint?
This is Des. I'll kick us off, and Kenya may have thoughts as well. Both of us are disabled voters, and as a result of our different disabilities, we have different access needs on election day. And we talked about this briefly in the presentation, that most of the barriers that we face on election day are due to decisions that were made that morning when the poll site was being set up. So, a set of stairs is not in this category, right? But I'm talking about the way the room is set up, the way that poll workers interact with us when we have a request or a need. And so I think the best thing a poll worker can do, a new poll worker or someone who's been doing this for decades, is to get familiar with these recommendations, get familiar with the common barriers that we face as disabled voters, and just keep it in your consciousness in the morning when you're setting up and as you're going through your day. How would a person in a wheelchair experience this polling site? How would a blind voter or a deaf voter experience this polling site? Could they vote privately and independently like other voters? Could they maneuver around the space? And just kind of putting on that access consciousness hat and being prepared. And also when you're going through training, asking the person training you, whoever it is in the clerk's office that's administering the training, ask them questions about disability and access so that it becomes more conscious and well known to other poll workers as well.
Yep, I would echo everything that's better. This is Kenya. I would echo everything that Dessa said. I unfortunately have gone to vote, and the first time that it seems like a poll worker is familiarizing themselves with that is when they see me, a blind voter, and so that shouldn't be the case. Typically, voting is very, very seamless for most people. And we would like the same experience. We don't want to be there for 2 hours trying to be able to vote. And we especially want to be able to cast our ballots privately and independently. And I just want to highlight one of the things that Dessa said is, if you're familiarizing yourself with the appropriate protocols, share that with other poll workers as well, because I don't necessarily think that a lot of this is because people are neglecting to do so. I think it's a lot of the times people are just not being trained appropriately. And so if you can share that knowledge with other people and make them aware and make those game day decisions, I think that would really increase access for people with disabilities.
Great, thank you. Next question. Recent surveys like the EVES, which is the Election Administration and Voting Survey, have shown a majority of voters with disabilities vote by mail. Of course, there are different barriers in place to voting by mail, such as signature requirements and drop box restrictions that would disproportionately affect voters with disabilities. What's your response to people or organizations who are reluctant to invest resources in improving polling place conditions because they see most people with disabilities voting by mail?
Kenny, you want to kick us off on that one?
Sure. I would just say that it's impossible to know how someone's going to vote. Yes, there are people with disabilities that may prefer to vote by mail, but that is not everybody. I personally, as a blind voter, do enjoy going in. And so what should be available to non-disabled people should be available to disabled people. And so that seems very sort of common sense to me, but I understand that some people may receive some pushback. But I would just say if you would offer something to a non-disabled person, that should be available to disabled people as well.
And this is Dessa, in addition to what Kenya's saying about equality of choice, and the fact that voting by mail is not accessible to all disabled people in itself, one thing that we found here in Michigan is that polling places are in a wide variety of buildings, from church halls to recreation centers to fire stations to schools. And many of those places are public places that were not accessible. And so the fact that a fire station or a city hall or a school, which are required by law to be accessible for everyone, were not accessible means that they're not just inaccessible on election day, they're inaccessible 365. And so this actually helps illuminate a much bigger infrastructure problem that disabled people face all year round. And so while I think the best thing we can do for all voters, particularly disabled voters, is having many choices and lots of flexibility in our voting system, meaning yes, mail, yes, drop boxes, yes, early voting, yes, no reason absentee, and multi-year absentee signups, like all of the things that create flexibility for voters, specifically help disabled voters because our needs are very diverse. We also have a real infrastructure problem that affects us year round, which is frankly why it's even more important that we show up to vote, because we need to be able to speak truth to power about how inaccessible our communities are. And so our ability to vote for candidates and issues that support infrastructure improvements and support our community is the only way for us to solve these problems. So it's just an important, larger context to add.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we do, as disabled voters, have a legal right to and deserve equal access to all parts of the voting process. And to not have that means that we're segregated into one option versus another, especially whenever, everyone's disability is very different. And so what works for one person might have barriers for someone else. Someone asked, were any language justice measures assessed?
This is Dessa. In our audit in 2022 here in Detroit, no, they were not. Not by us. Other organizations locally do that, but we did not incorporate it into this audit.
And then I think this one's a really important one to address. Is it bothersome when an individual without a disability wants to use the accessible voting system rather than a paper ballot due to the desire to want to use the touchscreen? Should the disabled voter have the first opportunity to use it if we only have one?
I can take that one. I would say yes. I do also want to highlight, though, that sometimes people may have more invisible disabilities, and so we may not know, if there's a particular reason that they would like to use the voting assist terminal. But if you know that they are not disabled in any way, yes, of course, the disabled person should have priority, especially if you don't know, if someone's going to walk in the door 2 minutes later.
This is Dessa. That said, you don't have to prove your disability to use the accessible voting machine, and anyone is entitled to use it. So, I've never seen a huge rush of people to use the VAT. There was one instance here in Michigan where a clerk actually did a contest to see how many people they could get to use the accessible voting machine, whether they were disabled or not, as a way of actually doing some really good day of intensive training for their poll workers. And so I think one advantage to more people using the VAT is that the poll workers become more accustomed to using it and it becomes more normalized. So, if somebody's just curious and there's a disabled voter there, I agree with Kenya that the disabled voter should get precedence. However, in general, anyone can use it, no questions asked. And to her point, many disabilities are not visible, and therefore a poll worker wouldn't know, and they're not allowed to question you.
Thank you. Has Detroit Disability Power submitted to be approved as an organization authorized to appoint challengers in Wayne County on election day so that issues can be pointed out and addressed in real time on election day?
So we have not. We worked with the Carter Center to do that in the previous election, and we're still figuring out our plan for 2024. So I'll write that on the list. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say is with the Carter Center and nonpartisan election observation, I'm not sure if our process has involved addressing issues day of on election day. I'm not sure how that fits into the wider framework of nonpartisan election observation, which we will be talking about at our 2 o'clock, the third part of this as well. So let me see, there's many here. What is your advice regarding privacy concerns amongst voters who cannot cast a ballot independently? How do we give voters the support they need, like poll worker assistance in filling out a ballot without sacrificing their right to a secret ballot?
So this is Dessa. The law says that a disabled voter can have anyone of their choice help them fill out a ballot unless it's their union rep or their employer. So one thing that often poll workers don't know is that a disabled voter could bring in their mom or their friend or their neighbor into the booth with them and can tell them how to fill out the ballot on their behalf. That's totally acceptable. Again, so long as it's not an employer or a union rep. And there are also protocols for poll workers to help a voter fill out a ballot, but I am hesitant to speak to those precisely because I'm forgetting them right now and I don't want to say the wrong thing. I believe it has to be 2 poll workers simultaneously, but I can't remember if there's more than that.
Thank you. Is there a resource or fast access process on voting day that people with disabilities can reach out to if they experience issues in Detroit?
So this is Dessa. We're part of a larger network of voter protection organizations that use the 866 Our Vote hotline, which is a national number, but that has local folks answering phones, lawyers mostly, to answer questions and solve problems in real time. So that's one thing that we point people to do real-time problem solving and to get questions answered. And then in some communities, we have close enough relationships with clerks that we can actually, if we hear from one of our members, for example, that something is going wrong, if, we get that text or that phone call, we can sometimes pick up the phone and call the right people. Although you can, with like 1,500 jurisdictions in Michigan for voting, that's not realistic across the state. So that 866 Our Vote number is probably the best way to go.
Great, thank you. While polling locations are checked using the ADA checklist, there's often an inherent bias that would prevent the full accessibility of the location to be considered. Have you considered offering pre-election day consultations with clerks for site accessibility? And also, have you considered partnering with local clerks to have disability sensitivity trainings built into traditional poll worker trainings to further stress importance?
Yes, this is Dessa. We have done both of those things and are open to continuing to do both of those things. Actually, just last week, one of my colleagues went to a possible new polling location here in Wayne County to check it out and to see if it would be a good fit. There was a law recently passed in Michigan that would expand what kind of places could be polling locations because we do have a kind of shrinking stock of public space available. Like, we have less schools than we used to, less civic buildings than we used to. And so trying to find new polling locations is something that a lot of clerks are interested in doing, and that's great, so long as what's chosen is fully accessible. So yes, we can assist in those kind of assessments. And yes, we can do sensitivity trainings and have been doing those for years. I think that the challenge really is there's a lot of jurisdictions. There's a lot of literally thousands and thousands of people that are hired for one day. And the training that those poll workers get is a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hose. And so, we want to add the necessary accessibility and disability components, but we're also really aware that it's a lot of information and that it's part of a much bigger, very large moving puzzle of administrating elections.
Thank you. Are polling location audits based on complaints received from disabled voters from certain jurisdictions, or is there a random sample of municipalities?
This is Dessa. So when we were doing a less sophisticated, smaller version, it was random. It was like, who do we know that's voting where when you go fill out this form? And that was because we didn't have the capacity to do a much bigger lift. Last year, when we partnered with the Carter Center and did the 261 polling locations, we chose jurisdictions and then did the full city. So, because of time, when they close, we can't, at 8 p.m., we couldn't go any further. So there was a handful of polling sites that we missed, which is why we hit 98% of all locations in those 15 jurisdictions. But we were trying to get like a full picture. So we had good data rather than a smattering or rather than just based on complaints.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question here. Are there any plans to expand the audit to include online accessible voting processes or measure performance against widely held best practices for this form of voting by mail?
Not exactly. That's a great question, and I would definitely be interested in thinking more about that. For 2024, I think we're thinking of doing something very similar, but on a much larger scale than we did in 2022.
Great. Thank you. So thank you for all of your work on that. It has been wonderful to partner with you and to be able to get this data. We're going to take a quick break until 1 o'clock Eastern, and then we will be having our next session on administering accessible elections, best practices. So it's a good time to get up, use the restroom, get some coffee, and we will see you back here in a few minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who were with us for the last session, we hope you had a few minutes to rest and refresh before this next conversation. To those of you who may be joining us anew, welcome. We are so glad that you are here with us. My name is Avery Davis Roberts, and I'm an Associate Director in the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. And I am going to be the moderator of what I am sure is going to be a super interesting conversation, really sort of building on what we heard in the last session, but talking directly with election officials who are thinking about this year-round, not just on election day, helping us to think about how we can make election processes more accessible. As Dessa and Kenya mentioned in the first session, of course, there is a federal role in administering accessible elections in the form of federal legislation, oversight, some funding, and the cooperation between the federal government and state and local election officials. The federal government really sort of sets these minimum expectations for ensuring our elections are accessible, but leaves the day-to-day work of making sure that implementation of elections is accessible to our state and local election officials. And so in this session, we'll really be hearing from election officials about what they do to administer accessible elections, some of the challenges that they face when they are doing this work, and the ways that NGOs and others in the community can really help them. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. We are joined today by State Election Director of Colorado since 2009, Judd Choate. Hi, Judd, nice to see you. We are joined by Heidi Burhans, who works in Iowa. She's worked in Iowa elections for 11 years and has held the State Election Director office for the last 5. Welcome, Heidi. We have Anthony Albence, who is a Delaware State Election Commissioner and has worked in Delaware elections for the past 16 years. Welcome, Anthony. And last but not least, Grace Banash of Shutesbury, Massachusetts, where she is an elections clerk. Welcome, Grace. Thank you so much for joining us. We will, at the end of this conversation, of course, have time for questions from the audience. Please don't wait and try and hold those questions in your mind. Feel free to drop them in the Q&A box now or as they come to you, and we will get to them towards the end. But maybe just to sort of kick us off, I'd like to start with you, Judd and Heidi. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the practices that you have implemented through your office to make elections, particularly the casting of a ballot, accessible in your state? And maybe we will start with you, Judd, since Colorado starts with a C and Iowa starts with an I.
We win again, Colorado at the front of the alphabet. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Avery, and I appreciate you and the Carter Center spending so much time on this really important topic and for inviting Colorado. Okay, well, so a couple of things, and I think Dessa and Kenya sort of touched on these in the first panel, and that is that there can be a law, and we can all sort of talk about prioritizing this kind of work. But really, at the end of the day, you sort of have to do the basics of put your time, put your money, and put your labor behind doing it well. And if you think it's important and you say the words that you believe it's important, then you actually have to put your labor behind it. And one of the things that we've done in Colorado is do audits of all of our polling places. We do those for major elections. We're somewhat different than most states in that we're an all-mail state, meaning that we mail ballots to all active registered voters. For us, that's about 3.8 million people of our eligible, 4.2, 4.3 million people. So that's a lot of people. They already have a ballot in their hand. And some of those like to come in person and vote on the accessible equipment, but it's a relatively small percentage. So, but we do in a major general election go to all 64 of our counties and review some or all of their polling places. And in a presidential election, we go to all of the 64 counties and review all of the polling places. So for us in 2020 presidential election, that was 366 polling places statewide. And we had somebody at each one of those polling places to make sure that those were accessible. We have a multi-page checklist that we use to measure accessibility, including everything, the 4 stages that Dessa and Kenya talked about. And we go through those because typically you're using a lot of the same polling places over and over. These are places we've seen before typically, and we know where the problems are likely to be. And after each election, and potentially even during each election, we're talking to counties about, are you fixing this? Are you addressing this? Because, we have old buildings or we have buildings that have problems. And then, as was mentioned before, poll workers who don't really deal with this issue very frequently, and thus, find that we find that they don't really know the answers to some of the questions they should know the answer to. But those are all things that we prioritize and really emphasize on our end. There is a mandatory training for all of our counties so that they are familiar with all of the requirements. And then prior to each election, each county must submit a plan which outlines each one of their polling places and how they plan to address accessibility issues related to each one of those. So if you do all of those things, typically you have demonstrated to counties that this is really important and we're going to pay very close attention to it. And because of that, it sort of generates good behavior, and you end up, meeting a lot of those accessibility needs.
Thanks, Judd. Heidi, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Avery, for your time in moderating this. And thank you for the invitation to participate today. Certainly, like Judd mentioned, there are those federal requirements that, of course, we work to ensure our counties are complying with those. But we also really have worked to focus on emphasizing the importance to the county auditors. In Iowa, we have 99 counties, and in each one, there's a county auditor who's the commissioner of elections. But we've changed our focus so that we really are trying to get the county auditors and their election staff to better understand how to communicate the importance then to their precinct election officials. So we've been developing some newer training materials that I'll touch on a little later in this panel, but we've put a priority on helping the auditors understand how to communicate the importance of and the accessibility of voting to these different communities. And so certainly we have the electronic accessible equipment and the curbside voting, but we've worked with the auditors so that they can have improved signage at all of their polling places, including for the absentee voting at their satellites and then at their offices. And we've worked to make that signage a little easier for the voters who pull up to understand what their options are and how to contact someone. And of course, the county auditors promote ahead of time that someone could certainly communicate in advance of arriving at the polling place and give the auditor, their poll workers heads up that they're going to need to be ready to provide curbside voting. But then we've improved the assistance training component so that the poll workers are a little more prepared on how to very quickly assist anyone in the community with disabilities who either wants curbside voting or they're coming into the polling place. We've stressed how important it is to have that electronic accessible equipment, not only set up in an appropriate location within the polling place, but to have it on and to already have it warmed up so that when someone comes in, they feel welcomed immediately and don't have to feel like now it's going to be a big production to allow them to vote. And we've prepared a number of videos over the years, and now we're really working to update those with some of the changes we've made in the training, but videos that teach the poll workers how to turn on and operate all of the accessible equipment and how to turn it off and how to troubleshoot throughout the day so that they have that instruction ahead of time. Then we encourage the auditors to give them the hands-on training when they come in for poll worker training. And then we provide some of these videos to the voters so that they understand how seamless the process should be when they arrive to the polling place. And then we've spent a lot of time partnering with advocacy organizations, including self-advocates, and then a variety of stakeholder groups, really first to improve the outreach and hopefully have a better connection with many of the voters in the community with disabilities. But then we're also taking on more of the opportunities to demonstrate our machines at the conferences and events. We're providing more outreach materials in conjunction with those advocacy organizations. Sometimes they prepare the first draft, send it to us. Sometimes we go to them with an idea, but it's really become even more collaborative over the last few years. And we also have a toolkit that we provide to these different organizations that can help them better explain to their members what their opportunities are for accessible voting, both ahead of the election and on election day. And that includes even voter registration, since we also have election day registration here in Iowa. And then we have a bit of a ramped up digital marketing and social media campaign. And we focus that to two different subsets of the community with disabilities. So we have one that's just to the general population, and then we've also provided more of a focus on veterans and military members who might have disabilities, and just helping them understand all of the opportunities.
Thanks, Heidi. That was really helpful. And, there are a few things that sort of really stuck out for me between your contribution, Heidi, and yours, Judd, just sort of thinking about the process and sort of the role of the state office as far as sort of leading by example, helping to set prioritization and just kind of creating the culture of accessibility and inclusion that can then kind of cascade down, I think is a really important point. And Heidi, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about how, I think having been a poll worker myself, we don't always think about the election process as really starting from way outside of the polling place. You know, it's often like at the check-in table, that's when the process starts for the voter. But really, your comments were making me think about how we really have to be thinking about even physically outside of the polling place, the signage, back to Dessa and Kenya's examples earlier, just getting through the door, you know, all of these physical things that maybe for poll workers who don't have a disability, they're not thinking about that. So how do we incorporate that into the training materials? And it sounds like you're really doing a lot with training materials and working with advocacy groups. So I hope we can talk about that a little bit more and that there'll be questions and comments on those too. Grace and Anthony, we've heard a little bit about some of the ways that the state offices are thinking about this. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how you incorporate accessibility into your election preparations and how maybe the relationship between the state offices and local officials, county officials work in your experience when it comes to accessibility of the election process? I don't know who wants to go first. Great.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Banish. I'm the town clerk in Shutesbury, Massachusetts, which is a very small town. Massachusetts runs elections at the municipal level, not the county level. So that's different from a lot of states. And as the chief local election official, I do literally everything having to do with elections that you can possibly imagine. And accessibility is part of the conversation at every single stage. So in addition to, we have plenty of disabled voters, as everyone does in every community. Disabled people are part of every community. I also happen to be disabled myself. So when we're talking about setting up the precinct, I'm not just thinking about it, how is someone who might be in a wheelchair going to navigate this space? I'm thinking also about how am I with my cane going to navigate this space? And I think that's really important to have disabled people be part of the decision-making process at every step of the way. There are things that I don't notice because just like there is no one expression of disability, there's also no one experience of disability. So there are going to be barriers in the space that I just won't notice because I don't have experiences that create those problems for me. And that's why it's so important to bring other people in, involve people in those conversations, check in with stakeholders. So for me, how I approach it is just, it has to be part of the conversation all the time in order for anything to work.
Thanks, Grace. Anthony, what would you add?
Sure, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation, and great to be on with a lot of great colleagues here as well. In Delaware, we have an interesting approach, really some of it obviously being a function of our size. We have really our elections administration centralized. We have a statewide office. And again, as you mentioned, I'm the state election commissioner. So really the local offices are part of our department, if you will. So part of our agencies. There's no separate local election agency. So it does give us the advantages of centralized planning and kind of strategy and administration, and which is really great. And a lot of my colleagues on the call have mentioned some of the excellent strategies and tactics that are used that we also use as well. We do have a positive relationship with our advocacy community here in Delaware. We try to engage with them regularly, you know, certainly outside of just the election cycle. And we work with them actually in conjunction with, over the past few years, we've really worked to enhance and expand our voter outreach and voter education generally. A lot of that was tied to the deployment of a new fleet of voting equipment across the board over the past few years. Obviously, COVID intervened with that as well. So we have, and we continue to partner with our advocacy community here to make sure that we are taking advantage of as many opportunities as possible to demonstrate the voting equipment to persons with disabilities. And when we purchased this equipment, this was a statewide purchase, of course, because of our centralized nature, the accessibility features of the equipment were paramount to that. And we really wanted to take a huge step forward from where we were with our prior generation of equipment. So that's been kind of a watchword. I mean, for example, this summer, just to give you one very quick example, we actually became aware through our partnership with our advocacy community here of an opportunity to kind of do a dual outreach to our military and overseas voters. We have a large Air Force base here in Delaware, Dover Air Force Base, that also was a combined event that was for military families and for the military office there on the base that works with family members as well as service members who have different needs. And so we were able to actually kind of outreach to a multitude of people at one time, which was a great opportunity. And that was really something we became aware of through our partnership with our advocacy community here in the state. We were very happy about that. But some of the things that we also do is, again, because of our smaller size, this facilitates some of this being a little bit easier. But we are working with our county offices, for example, right now to do a comprehensive review of all of our polling locations as well, looking at how we can enhance accessibility, how we can improve them. A benefit of some of the growth we've seen in the state, especially in the southern part of Delaware, in the beach areas, for example, is that we have a lot of newer facilities coming online. So we're actually able to relocate a lot of polling places from facilities that were not as accessible and where they previously were in more rural areas that have become more developed now. There are more options so that we can do that. So that's been a real plus. And just going back for a moment to our work with our advocacy community, we invite individuals, we provide credentials, and we invited those individuals to visit all our polling places on election day, to attend our trainings and to provide us feedback. And they do provide a report. It's a very honest report. It calls us out on things that we need to improve on, and we know we do. And we use that as a basis to work on, not just responding to those items, but really using them as a springboard for these more proactive steps. And it's led us over the years to things, as I mentioned, individuals attending our training, giving us feedback. I think Heidi mentioned this as well, working with folks to help us with our curriculum, how to properly communicate, how to effectively communicate the needs of voters with disabilities to our election officers, as we call them, poll workers, for whom this may not be an everyday experience, and for whom we know we're asking them to do a lot. But we try to be very clear in our training that all of your responsibilities are important, and that this type of work to ensure that all the voters are given the same experience, regardless of level of ability, is paramount. That's just as important as making sure you carry out the other elections laws and regulations as well. It's not an afterthought. It's really one of your core responsibilities. So those are a few of the things that we've been doing.
Thanks, Anthony. I really appreciate your emphasis on the partnership. And I think that there's probably a lot that we can sort of pull out of that as we think about kind of connecting some of these conversations also to the audit that Kenya and Dessa were describing in the first session, sort of thinking about, like, are there ways that we can continue to sort of build partnerships? What would be helpful to you from NGOs and advocacy groups? It sounds like they're already giving you a lot of feedback in Delaware, but are there other ways that there are sort of lessons learned, I guess, or good practices that we could encourage across the country? Maybe turning now to some of the opportunities. What opportunities to increase outreach and turnout of voters with disabilities are you aware of? And are there any that are just sort of things that you are really looking forward to working on in advance of 2024? And maybe I'll turn to you, Grace, to answer that first.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. So in Massachusetts, we've just started we have a new option for disabled voters and for overseas voters, working with Democracy Live for the Omni ballot platform. Haven't had anyone use it yet, but big reason why that is happening is because a lot of voters aren't aware that it's an option yet, and people don't necessarily understand how to use it. So I have been working on drafting our web pages and our information that we're going to start sending out at the start of the year. It's been an
I was about to say something strange is happening, Grace. I don't
and it's been an interesting thing of thinking about how do I make sure that people actually understand this option is available to them, while also there are restrictions on this option. And this is part of when we get into a big question of accessibility when it comes to voting, is we do have options that are supposed to be for the purpose of accessibility, but if those options are overly restricted, to very specific people, then maybe not everyone who would benefit from that is able to use it. And one of the things I've been wrestling with is, how do I need to communicate this to everybody so that people are aware the option exists and also are able to understand on their own whether or not they're eligible to participate in it. So that it's a complicated question. It's got a lot to do with language from at least my perspective, because this is going to be all about how do I communicate this to my community. And one of the things that's really important for me in terms of accessibility and being in local government and in terms of voting rights is using plain language. You should not need to have a high reading level to understand the instructions for how to vote. Well, when you're working with a really complicated technical system, that can get really tricky really fast. So that's something I've been working on. A big thing for me going forward is trying to think about, is this web content, is this written content going to work with a screen reader from the start of when we start thinking about that, so we don't have to later on go back and revise things. Just trying to think about what's going to happen when the screen reader gets to this image on the web page. What are people going to hear? Stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot we can do on election day itself, but there is so much more we can do in the days leading up to it.
And Grace, just for those who might not be familiar with OmniBallot, could you summarize what that is? And I don't know if it's 2 sentences.
2 sentences. OmniBallot is a way to vote that is both secure and online.
Aha. That was 1 sentence. I know. That is
Here we go.
Good job. Thanks for that, Grace. And I saw lots of nodding from others on the panel as you were sort of describing the challenges of the communication challenges around this particular issue. I think that there's probably lots of shared excitement about the opportunities maybe and concerns about how to do this. So I'm sure others will chime in. But Anthony, I don't know, what opportunities are you sort of excited about and wrestling with right now?
Sure. I think what we're excited about is the continued outreach options, as I mentioned, demonstrating our equipment, getting out there, maybe getting out to communities that maybe with the hiatus that happened with COVID over a couple of years, we didn't get to show how our actual voting experience, in-person voting experience, can provide that independent, private type of voting experience to an individual, regardless of abilities. Because I think that's really our goal. Of course, I know it's everyone's goal. There's always the option for individuals to provide assistance, for someone to bring someone in to vote with them. But again, it doesn't preserve that anonymity of the vote, that secrecy of the vote, which is certainly paramount. Going back to what Grace mentioned a few minutes ago, we've been very fortunate. Actually, many years back, we partnered initially with Democracy Live in one of the initial programs that the EAC had many years ago when Delaware first allowed for some of the electronic transmission and return options to come into our law. And so we've been very proud to work with them. And now with some recent additional funds that have come about through the Federal Voting Assistance Program, we are talking with Democracy Live. How can we improve that platform? For example, like Grace mentioned, it's a great platform, but for a lot of our folks, whether they be individuals with disabilities or sometimes individuals living overseas, it's sometimes not always the easiest experience to use, and that's nothing negative towards that particular platform, but just in general. So we're really working with them now to try to make that more accessible at every level. So I think that's what we're looking forward to are those 2 items, and then I think also implementing some of the changes in the polling places, whether that be the enhanced plans for signage and accessibility, seeing how our new polling places, how those perform compared to those ones we've replaced with those with higher levels of accessibility. The challenge is always going to be, I think, is of course funding is always a challenge, and the fact that for the physical locations for polling places, like all of us, we're somewhat limited, especially in some communities, as to what facilities are available and the level of accessibility that is there. And certainly, of course, we are not we do not have funds, to undertake those improvements. So maybe working with our community partners like our advocacy groups to help perhaps them to leverage for some additional funding, sometimes for some of these locations to help make those improvements. Obviously, it'll benefit anyone who uses the facility, not just voters.
Thanks, Anthony. And that's actually a great segue to our next question. I'd love to hear from you, Heidi, and then Judd, about not just some of the opportunities and things you're excited about, but what are some of the challenges that you're facing when it comes to resolving accessibility related issues at polling places? And are there ways, kind of coming back to that partnership question, are there ways that the advocacy community might be able to help you address some of them, as Anthony was just suggesting? So Heidi, maybe starting with you.
A few years ago, we rolled out in an effort to help the auditors ensure ADA compliance of their polling places, a tablet that has a program in it, so they can take that every time they go to a polling place, which of course is supposed to be at least once a year. They could take the tablet and they could document everything about the polling place, not only what items might need fixed if there's cracked sidewalk, but just document even the width of the doorway and location of possible obstacles within the polling place. They could take photos, especially if there is something that needs to be fixed, and they could start developing this database. But we now have some opportunities to improve that tablet, and I'd like to be able to incorporate a piece into it where they can use that information when they're talking to the poll workers to help the poll workers understand what could be viewed as an obstacle or what those measurements are. And that could also work in conjunction with our quick check guide, which is a foldout that we developed for the poll workers to have at the polling place on election day. And it's something that allows them to view for quick fixes. So if there's a location of a sign that maybe is hanging too low from the ceiling, or noting where the water fountain is that juts out from the wall, so place a cone out in front of that. And then we turned it into a video so they could use that ahead of time in their poll worker training. But that quick check guide covers 3 areas: outside, entrances, and then inside the polling place. And so I think there's some opportunity to combine some aspects of that with the tablet that they had used previously. But then we've also put a greater emphasis on etiquette and communication training with the auditors and their election staff and the poll workers. So we're really working to develop improved training materials for that. And because of that effort, we have been working even closer with the advocacy organizations to learn better about what that appropriate language is. To Grace's point, making it very easy to understand. And again, this is a piece I'm talking about helping the PEOs understand so that they know how to communicate with those voters. But one of the challenges is sometimes when we receive a phone call on election day, either from a county auditor or maybe directly from a voter, sometimes we don't know all of the specifics, or sometimes if we're hearing from a voter, we may not be at the top of their list of trusted contacts. And so in 2020, we started inviting Disability Rights Iowa to bring staff into our office on election day. And so when we receive a phone call from a voter or the county auditor regarding an issue at a polling place, then we get them on the line as well. Our staff are still communicating directly with them, but the DRI personnel can maybe help translate for us if there is a detail that maybe we're not understanding, and they can help guide us sometimes too in that communication back to the voter. But we also are just really making a concerted effort for stakeholder groups to understand how to use our accessibility toolkit. We all know the joke about, hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So we've recognized that folks trust their people. And so we really want to provide the appropriate tools to those stakeholders and those advocacy groups to whom voters with disabilities turn when they have questions, when they have concerns, when they have challenges. And so then kind of as an offshoot of that goal, we've started focusing on everything. Focusing on relationship building between the county auditors and the communities in their county. And we're really hoping to get this up and running. We've been working on fleshing out the details on a county coordinator program where each county would have a designated accessibility coordinator, and that would be a poll worker. And eventually we would love to have one of those in each precinct. That's a very lofty goal. I think we could get there, but it's going to take quite a bit of buy-in from all of the stakeholders. But we're hoping that if voters with disabilities in their community, in their county, have a designated resource from the election administration staff, then maybe they also could start feeling more comfortable about taking their questions directly to those election administrators. And maybe that would also further help some of the other voters find trust and credibility and integrity in the election process.
Thanks, Heidi. Judd, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, a couple of things. So one thing that's a real opportunity is what Grace and Anthony and Heidi have all mentioned, and that is electronic options for either accessing a ballot or accessing and returning a ballot. Yes, Liz mentioned in the Q&A that there are security concerns about that. Absolutely, we're aware of those, and I think all states that are all states are required to do that for military and overseas voters, but all states that are really trying to push it, which we are, other states are really trying to prioritize those questions related to security. The one of the ways that we address that is through the way that it's hosted. So we also use Democracy Live. We started with Everyone Counts, but they went belly up a couple of years ago. So we switched to Democracy Live. The way Democracy Live works is it can be hosted locally on your system, or it can be hosted centrally on their system. We do not permit our voters to host it or to operate through the Democracy Live system. They have to host it locally, which means that your voter isn't transmitting information to a central location. It's on their system. And then instead of sharing it through an email return, we use a file share, which is double encrypted. So it's encrypted as it goes out, it's encrypted as it comes back. So that addresses many of the concerns which have been highlighted by the external groups dealing with sort of the whole question of internet voting. So that's one thing. And then I'm going to go a completely different direction.
Do it.
Okay. My other direction is, well, actually, I have a subsidiary question to that, which I think is an interesting one for the audience. So we have a specific designation in our law that allows for accessibility voting using that electronic ballot. And you have to sign up each election. So each election you want an electronic ballot as a person that qualifies as needing an accessible ballot. You submit that, the county then issues that ballot to you. Here's the question, and that is, should we keep a list of that? Should we keep a list of who is requesting an accessible ballot and thereby create a record which says that this voter has requested an accessible ballot and thus has a disability? So the question is it a good idea to keep a record that a voter has said they want a disability ballot, or is it better to have voters just sign up every election? So I have that. And then the other completely different topic I was going to mention is occasionally we find ourselves in a situation where we have to sue a county because they are not in compliance, or they year after year after year will not get into compliance. We haven't had to do that on accessibility, but I have to tell you, I've written threatening letters, and threatening letters can often be very persuasive. So that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. So we go that direction occasionally. In Colorado, we are not afraid to litigate. All right, so back to my original question. If somebody wants to comment to that, I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from other panelists if you have thoughts. I thought I saw Grace lean in a little bit and look like about the question.
I think it's a really interesting question. One of the first things that always pops into my head whenever we're asking, should we be collecting this data, is, are we required to be collecting this data? Do we need to use this data for anything in the future? There's definitely data that we're required to collect that I'm like, well, this just goes nowhere. It's going to sit on this spreadsheet forever and ever, and no one is ever going to do anything with it. There's also data that we're not required to collect that I might make my own spreadsheet and start collecting because I actually find out down the line I do actually need that information. This is an interesting question, I think, because part of it is the data could help you figure out where is need and where is it not being addressed. The data could also be used to target individual voters. So that's a really, really tricky question.
Thanks, Judd.
Yeah, I like that one. I mean, it's interesting, right now, I think where we are with Democracy Live is you would not be able to tell from the final result, the data that I believe we will end up having at the final end, you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between I think a UOCAVA ballot and an accessible vote by mail ballot. I think that if we were going to have that data, it would, both groups of voters are using the same tool. But yeah, you've stumped me with that one. I like it.
Well, Judd has left us with a stumper. I guess maybe just as one final round before we get to audience questions, lightning round, one sentence each. What would be your sort of top priorities for making 2024 more accessible? And I am going to start with Heidi. Sorry, didn't give you much time to think about it. And to formulate one sentence.
Right. The one sentence part is the hard part.
You can have 3 sentences.
That's very generous of you. Thank you. I'll do it in one. Really, our priority is reaching as many voters as we can who have a disability and have had questions or concerns about accessibility to voting and to voter registration. So we really want to prioritize that county coordinator program and a few other ideas that are starting to take shape regarding partnerships with veterans and teenagers with the disability community.
Thanks, Heidi. Who'd like to go next?
I can go next. Just try to keep it to a sentence or two as well. It's very simple. I think trying to continue what we're doing in the various strategies, but really the themes being increasing accessibility, removing impediments would be the key. It's an ongoing challenge, and we're never going to be done. But we at least will take another bite at the apple, and hopefully have a plan to eat most of the apple. Is a terrible analogy, but hopefully get the job done, but really do it in partnership with those in the community, with those in the advocacy community, and continue to build and strengthen those partnerships.
Wonderful. Thank you. Grace?
I have an I'll just throw mine in. So in 2022, we had 173 voters use an accessible ballot, which were not UOCAVA, so using the statewide accessible ballot. And in 2020, we had 204. I know that there are a lot more people in the state of Colorado who qualify for that ballot who are not using it. So my two-part is we need to improve and expand within the four corners of what we're permitted under the statute, and then just improve the way it's administered, which goes to that question of, can you sign up to always get it? And if you sign up to always get it, what do I do with what are my limitations as to use of that information? So those are the kinds of things that we're working on.
Thanks, Judd, and Grace.
For me, it's all about poll worker training. The presidential election years, that's the year when the poll workers are actually excited about training. And so this is the big chance for me to start building some of that expertise, start making sure that people are thinking about accessibility at every step of the process. And also, it's a good opportunity when all the poll workers show up for the training and actually stay for the whole time. It's a really good chance to brainstorm and work on any problems we might have with our supplies or our tools or our instructions. So I am excited for all the energy that is coming our way.
I like the glass half full approach to that energy. Thank you so much, everyone. And so let's turn to questions from the audience now. I know that there's a couple in the Q&A box. Jessica says she'd love to hear more about the specifics on the digital marketing campaign and targeted outreach. When did you start? Which platforms do you use? And how do you measure success? I think that is to you, Heidi.
Sure. It's been ongoing since I think 2019, 2020. And we place the ads on Facebook for social media, but then we have them on different websites, streaming channels, and news feeds. And I'm not the communications director, so I don't have all the specifics, but I'd be very happy to connect you. Feel free to email me after today's event, and I can connect you with that communications director. But we've found a number of ways to use additional personalities so that it's not only our secretary that people would hear or see in all of the ads. And so in the fall, we work with the football coaches of the universities in the state, and then there are 3 public universities. And then throughout the winter, we'll work with the basketball coaches, because in Iowa, we don't have any professional sports teams. So college gets everybody's energy and time. So that's also been something that's really helped get some of the attention on those digital ads.
Thanks, Heidi. Go ahead, Jordan.
I actually want to take a step back and ask the larger group about how you engage with how you engage with the community of voters with disabilities. Heidi, I know you just gave us a primer on your direct marketing campaign. And Anthony, you mentioned that you work closely with these organizations. But Judd, could you tell us a little bit about what outreach looks like to this community in Colorado?
Yeah, I can. So in our department, we have a person who's pretty much like 90% dedicated to doing accessibility voting. So I have a person on staff. Her name is Lisa. She is our ADA compliance coordinator. She also is ADA compliance coordinator for the entire department. So not just for voting, but also for other department related issues. And by the way, in the first panel, there was this really great point that Dessa made about the accessibility for voting often means accessibility for the other 345 days, 350 days a year. And so we really make that point to our counties that use voting, use elections as a cudgel to get good funding from your county commissioners to address things that are a problem all the time and can be an improvement for all of your constituents, not just those who want to vote in person. So that's one thing. So we have a person who's dedicated to do that work all the time. We do have periodic meetings. We used to do those a lot more when we were a vote in person state, but we became a mail ballot state. And really, not that this is a forum to advocate for mail ballot, but mail ballot really addresses a lot of issues related to accessibility, because so many people who have accessibility issues can be, those can be addressed by the way that that ballot is received and voted. Now, not everybody, and I certainly don't suggest that it meets everybody's needs, but for many people it does. And then if you add on top of that the ability to receive an electronic ballot and vote that ballot on your system, which you have probably pretty substantial control over, that also meets a set of needs. So we try to have good relationships with our advocacy community, have routine meetings and so forth. But I have to tell you that those are not as frequent or as deep and fruitful as they used to be, because we've largely addressed a lot of the concerns.
Thank you for that. I actually don't believe that I have any more questions. I do want to posit to you guys a question that was asked in the first session, and it was also from Jessica, and she was asking, this is her first time as a poll worker this year. What can she do to make sure that elections are accessible in her precinct or jurisdiction where she's working? And I'm going to start with Grace.
I've got.
No one's ready, so
I'm ready. I've got a couple tips. There's one thing we always do every time is we put the reading glasses next to the pen. So a lot of people have reading glasses in their kits, either because people forgot their reading glasses or maybe their eyesight is getting worse and they haven't noticed it and they don't have their own reading glasses. It used to be people had to ask permission to use those. Instead of doing that, now what we do is we put them right next to the voting booths, right next to the pens. You can grab a set of reading glasses when you grab your pen. It's pretty easy to make sure they don't walk out the door, but if one or two of them walks out the door, I think we've been doing it for 5 years and we've only ever lost one set of readers so far. So it's not an issue. And anytime you have an opportunity to let people access an accessibility tool or option without having to ask permission. No one should have to ask permission in order to exercise their right to vote. So that's a big one. The other thing is keep looking around to make sure that the walkways actually are unobstructed. It is very, very common for somebody to move a chair in the way or leave a backpack somewhere. And that's something you can do like throughout the day. Just take a look around the room. Did anybody leave anything in the way? Is someone still able to get from point A to point B unobstructed? Those are two of my usual tips.
Does anyone want to volunteer to go next, or?
Sure, this is Anthony. I could jump in. One of the things we've always tried to do, even with our prior generation of voting equipment, and now with our current generation with much more sophisticated accessibility features, is that we encourage in our training that that is to be made similar to what Grace had mentioned, that those resources are to be made available to everyone. We emphasize that in training, and that any voter, is eligible to use that. Of course, part of the training for election officers obviously is sensitivity to a whole spectrum of needs, and that one may not have a need that's visible, so to speak, or obvious, if you will, and that our voting experience is to be accessible for everyone, regardless of their level of ability or whatever challenges they may face. We really encourage that. Again, there's no stigma to using that equipment. The equipment's available to everyone. It enhances everyone's voting experience, and really we encourage everyone to use it, because we think as more of our election officers get familiar with it, as more voters get familiar with it, they can tell the story to their families and friends how it is easy to use, how it is available to you, and hopefully maybe encourage some people in their life who may otherwise be perhaps hesitant to try to vote on their own, or to vote at a polling place, for example, to do so, that they can have a very positive experience, again, independent private and secure as well.
Thank you. And Judd, I'm just going to go ahead and call on you. You seem ready.
Well, I would just say take the training, which you're required to take, and take it seriously. Watch it, pay attention, take notes, and then when you see something when you're at your polling place and it doesn't look right, or you think, gosh, sounds like we could do that better, either fix it in the moment or communicate that to your county or to your state and make sure that it's something that, you know, we think about in the future so we can do it better next time.
Thank you. And all of that was certainly robust. So Heidi, I understand if you don't have anything to add, but would you like to add anything?
I'll add two quick ones, although all of my colleagues on the panel make excellent points. And I even have a couple of takeaways from them that I'm going to share with our auditors. But the other two things I would add are, as a new poll worker, as a poll worker anytime, don't assume that someone needs assistance. Don't just approach them with, okay, here's your ballot and we'll go ahead and help you. We'll get you over here. And then the other one is using person first language, which I've just learned a lot about over the last year, thanks to Disability Rights Iowa and our Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council. And that basically means if you're if you're referring to the voter who is in a wheelchair instead of the wheelchair voter, or a voter with a visual impairment instead of the blind person. Those are very basic examples, but those are two additional contributions I'd make.
Thank you. Those were very thoughtful and very much grateful for those contributions. I do want to ask one question before we let you all go. Sincerely appreciate you all joining us today. But are there any structural or institutional challenges that you face in trying to make elections more accessible and make voter turnout for people with disabilities higher than what it is currently? Jed, I want to start with you.
Well, so one thing that I would note to all of the accessibility community is, while you may not be able to sort of help on the individual level, because it really is, you know, that's why we have thousands of poll workers. You can help by pooling your efforts and advocating for more money. You may not be aware that we did formerly have a Help America Vote Act funding stream for accessibility improvements at the state level and then down into the county level and local. But that money dried up in 2016. In fact, it really dried up in 2004. And then we got one more funding stream for $1 million in 2016. And then that was the last of the money. In fact, we had to spend it before 2020. We were required to by the law. So that we don't have any money, and we haven't had any money for years. So if I had a polling place that needed a new door or an elevator or a ramp, I can't help them. They're on their own. So if we got another stream of HAVA accessibility funds, that would be really important.
Would you guys like to add anything else to that?
I can jump in on that. I want to completely echo 100% what Judd just said, truthfully, because that's a conversation we have had many, many times in our circles here in Delaware. You know, I remember from years ago, right, we did tons of grants to polling places. And now I'm sure Judd counties have the same experience. We have sometimes folks coming back to us now needing to update or repair those, and we have to tell them we don't have the funds, are no longer available. And you know, that gets to the bigger question, right? There's just some communities that, and it may be a building that's, you know, even in our experience recently in some of our reporting back from our advocacy partners, even relatively new buildings, you know, that we're using as polling places, schools that have just been built. We get a list of items where they're not accessible, and it's a little perplexing. It's a new building; it was just built, you know. And of course, like Judd was mentioning, we don't have resources to build a new ramp or put a new door in. We can ask the school district, you know, for example, about it, but our hands are somewhat tied. So yeah, that would be ideal if funding were to be available again. You know, perhaps that would be a really great resource to have to address those issues.
Thank you guys so much for your contributions to this panel. And also thank you for highlighting those challenges so that the community at large can be more aware of the challenges you guys face and trying to improve turnout for everyone who can cast a ballot. To be honest, thank you, Avery, for moderating the session, and we will actually pass it on to our next event, which starts at 1 o'clock, which is an overview and explainer of the methods we used in conducting these polling site audits. Again, thank you guys so much, and hopefully you're able to stay on for the last session. Thank you. Good afternoon, you all. Thank you for joining us in our third session, Replicating Polling Site Accessibility Audits. We will have a presentation from Professor Leah Marabaki. She's an expert in election administration, and she'll be joined by the voting rights expert at the Carter Center with a particular focus on disability and elections, Sarah Blahovec. If you experience any technical issues with interpretation or captioning, please email me at jordan.mcnary@cartercenter.org. But otherwise, this program will provide an overview of exactly how we went about conducting the polling site audits with our partner Detroit Disability Power in Michigan in 2022. And also towards the end, we'll provide some opportunities for you to sign up to hopefully replicate them in the future. When you guys are ready, we are. Thank you, Leah and Sarah.
We're ready. Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you for having us and welcome everyone. Thank you to the panelists so far. Great discussion and important topics that we covered. So as Jordan introduced, we will be going over some of the methodologies that the Carter Center and Detroit Disability Power followed for the Michigan audits. We hope to replicate those audits in more states and jurisdictions into 2024 and another election year. So this is our first effort to share what we have done and to build more partnerships. And the bigger reason why we're doing this today, particularly this panel, is for transparency purposes. The accessibility audits are based on international election observation standards. Non-partisan election observation is one of the core activities that the Carter Center has been conducting overseas, and in the recent years, it has been conducting in the US context. We also hope to provide a data-driven approach to observation. Consistency is important. Accessibility varies depending on the jurisdiction and the state, but what we hope to do is to develop metrics and procedures to evaluate those processes and do so in a consistent manner so that we can meaningfully compare. We also hope to build more capacity. There are so many organizations and groups and individuals who do this work on the ground, including election officials, of course. We need resources, we need capacity, we need time. So joining forces, because we have the common mission on improving access for all voters, this is a great opportunity to do this and share our resources with you and hopefully take it from there for future iterations of this project. We can go to the next slide. So what we are going to present today with Sarah is the steps that we took in 2022 for the Michigan audit and audits in other states, information about the timeline, some of the core steps that we took to do this work. We tried to summarize it into 5. Sarah is going to be taking over the rest of the presentation until the last point for data, where I will be taking over. An overview of those steps involved familiarizing yourselves with election laws in your state, who is in charge of administering them. They may seem very intuitive, but there's so many details that we need to make sure to address so that we are prepared. How those laws are interpreted, both by election officials, but also by organizations who will be doing the work on the ground. A very important step, authorization to deploy observers in the target states and or jurisdictions, what that means, what kind of observers those are. Of course, something that Dessa and Kenya talked about in the first panel, recruitment, training, deployment on volunteers, all of the logistics and timeline, and data collection analysis, which what happens in the back end after the observation mission is over, how we produce findings and disseminate them in a way that is meaningful, is useful, and how do we make change incrementally, particularly knowing that funding may not be available. And of course, publicizing them and disseminating to the broader audience outside from election officials themselves. We can go to the next slide, and I will be taking this to Sarah to take over. Thank you.
Sorry, I am on mute. So step one, as Leah mentioned, is reviewing the election laws in the target state. It's important to do this. We will be going through a timeline of when we propose going through these steps, but every state really varies in how observers are allowed to observe, whether they're allowed to observe, what parts of the voting process they're allowed to observe as well. So we have linked on in the slides, but the National Conference of State Legislatures has a web page detailing the policies for election observers. And so that has the specific rules for each state, and that would be the first place that someone who is interested in doing replicating this kind of survey would need to go and see, you know, what am I allowed to do? What are observers allowed to do? What are the processes for seeking authorization to observe? In the case of the survey that we did in 2022, access to the polling place meant access to the exterior of the polling site, having a clear view of all of the ballot marking devices, and maintaining a clear view of all the ballot marking devices. As I said, it really differs state to state. Even in the U.S. Government Accountability Office's report in 2016, if you take a closer look at those numbers, you'll see that they did not have full access to all of the polling places that they observed. It was a nationwide survey. So some places they were only allowed partial access inside the polling place, and then some places they were not allowed in the polling place to observe at all. So it's important to figure out, you know, to what extent are you able to do that? Whether it's something where you're just looking at the exterior of the polling place or you have some sort of access inside, then figuring out what you need to do, what is the process to seek authorization to observe, as well as what are observers called. And we'll be talking about that, I believe, in the next slide. So we can go to the next slide. Yes, so for 2022 in the Michigan audit, there are restrictions in Michigan on who is allowed to observe. There are two different categories of observers in the polling place. Poll watchers have restricted access. They do not have full access to the voting process. Anyone, if I recall correctly, anyone is allowed to be a poll watcher, any member of the public. Poll challengers have almost the same access as poll workers. And so in Michigan, we had to seek authorization for our observers to be poll challengers, which I know that is kind of a confusing title because it sounds a little bit combative, like you're going to be challenging, you know, who is allowed to vote, or really like looking over that process. We did not interfere in the voting process at all. That's just what they're called in Michigan. So the Carter Center satisfied eligibility requirements for observation as an incorporated organization, and working with Detroit Disability Power, we submitted to get credentials for our observers to be poll challengers, where they would have they would have a higher level of access to be able to fully observe the polling place, including looking at the stations for wheelchair accessible paper ballot voting and the voter access terminal. We can go on to the next slide. So step two is figuring out or seeking authorization to observe. So this is also where the National Conference on State Legislatures guide will be helpful. You need to figure out who do you need to request authorization from. In the case of Michigan, it was requesting authorization from local clerks. Figuring out how far in advance you should submit your request. I don't have the number off the top of my head. I think we have in the next few slides, we have our timeline. We do recommend in our methodology starting planning, including looking at the laws in your state at least 3 months beforehand, so you have plenty of time to prepare. In Michigan, we had a 10-day window it was 30 days in advance, but no later than 20 days before the election. So it's really important to find out when you need to submit your request, because there may be specific windows of time where you have to submit the authorization. It's also helpful to look at when poll worker training takes place, and if you can, try to seek authorization before that. That is something that can be useful to the election office so that they can prepare poll workers for observers being in the polling place and know, how this group of people will be operating in the polling place and that they are allowed to be there. What information are you required to submit with your request? We in Michigan submitted our letter, which was notarized, asking for the ability to observe, as well as submitting a credential, a sample credential that we would use to get into the polling place. So you need to figure out what your state's requirements are, what kind of information are you required to submit with your request, but also what information is useful to include that might not be required. You might want to share where the other locations are that you're planning on observing, so they have information on that. So, there's also, supplemental information that you can include. How many observers are going to be there? Generally, what time of day are they going to be there? Think about useful logistical information that can provide some context and let them know how you're planning to operate. And then how long does a request process last, and what should you do if it's delayed or denied? So again, knowing what those deadlines are, and then having a plan if it's delayed or denied, whether there's an appeal process, if there's a way that you can still, appeal that decision if it is denied. Next slide. Okay, so in Michigan, this is kind of our process and timeline. We had to submit a formal written request to the clerk and to all the clerks in the jurisdictions that we were seeking to observe. So we created a tracker of when those authorizations were submitted, and when we heard back, to try to keep track of that information, which was really useful. The request must be sent during a 10-day window between 20 to 30 days prior to an election. So being aware of those timelines and making sure that we were submitting within the required window. Yes, the request included the statement of intent to deploy the number of poll challengers, excuse me, losing my voice, statement of intent to deploy the number of poll challengers that we were planning to deploy, the statement of eligibility based on Michigan law, the copy of the credentials that were to be used by the observers, and then we needed to have a notarized signature of the chief presiding officer, secretary, or another officer. So the clerks in Michigan are required to approve unless they demonstrate a deficiency in the application. And I don't recall that we had any sort of issues with sorry, seeing a note here, the asterisks on here. So for the statement of intent to deploy, statement of eligibility, and then the notarized signatures were required. And then we submitted the the credential copy as just an optional piece of information that they could use as what our observers were going to be using. So the clerks must approve unless they demonstrate a deficiency in the application. I don't recall that we ran into that. And then there is an appeal process to the Secretary of State or Chief Elections Officer that is available. And so one thing we did is have that kind of appeal ready to go in case that became an issue. Next slide. So in terms of our timeline, prior to 20 to 30 days before the November 8th, 2022 election, we assembled the contact information for election officials and created that contact and request tracking sheet so that we could keep on top of who we had submitted requests to whenever they had responded. We prepared the request letter and notarized it, prepared the sample credentials and combined it into a PDF, and then prepared all of that information for sending the request so that it was ready whenever that window opened up. Next slide. So in the 10-day window opening before the November 8th, 2022 election, we sent the request email with the required documents and the sample credentials. That was on October 12th. That was 28 days before Election Day. Since it was such a small window, we followed up 2 days after that to non-responsive clerks via email. And then 4 days after that, called election officials to inquire about the status of the request. Again, because it was such a small window of time, sending more contacts out, especially considering that clerks are often, overworked, have a lot going on, and things can slip off the radar, especially as they get closer to the election. And then by October 21st, we submitted a formal appeal if grounds for rejection were lacking merit, and contacted the state election office if election officials were non-responsive. So following up on that, appeals process or lack of contact from the local election officials. Next slide. So in terms of step 3, that is recruitment and training of observers. One thing that we were very lucky of here is that we were working with Detroit Disability Power, which already had some volunteers that they've been doing this for several years. But we used our networks as well to recruit a number of observers who weren't they were new to disability and polling place audits for the most part. There were a few from local disability organizations, but we had a few as well who were not familiar with it. And we'll be talking about what that training entailed, but using your networks to draw from a volunteer pool that is representative of the population that the audit aims to benefit. One thing to note is that in some states, you are required to be a citizen in the state that you are observing. That is not the case for all states. So that's another thing to pay attention to whenever you are seeking, when you're seeking authorization, or whenever you're looking at the state's elections laws, is figure out, is this someone who needs to be a resident of this state to be able to observe? Obviously we want to be pulling from the local community as well when we're talking about polling place observation, because these are the voters in the community that are impacted. And so making sure that you're drawing from that population in that area, but also trying to ensure that you have people with disabilities who are participating in this because they have familiarity with it. Now, it can be a little bit of a challenge because in some cases, when we're dealing with inaccessible polling places, someone may not be able to get into the polling place because of those access barriers. We did have in a lot of cases where observers were paired up, where there were 2 observers who were going together. So that might be an option. But there are also other ways to get involved in terms of the data analysis if participating in this kind of observation is not accessible for some reason. We did have multiple modes of outreach, so emails, in person, and social media for reaching out to volunteers. And then this is a note from Leah, academics love to be a part of these efforts. There might be additional paperwork for them to be able to participate, which can affect the timeline. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you are drawing from, you're trying to create your volunteer pool. And another thing I'll say, since I didn't say it explicitly, disability community organizations. So centers for independent living, developmental disability councils, protection and advocacy agencies, some of which are already doing these in various states. One of our partners, National Disability Rights Network, which oversees the protection and advocacy agencies, several of those organizations do already conduct polling place accessibility audits. So it's also something where you might want to check and see what work is already being done, if any is being done in the state. So certainly look at, as well, just mainstream not disability rights organizations, but voting organizations like League of Women Voters may be interested, or other kind of civic engagement groups in your area, provided that they are nonpartisan. Next slide. So whenever it comes to training observers, you can offer multiple training modes, in person, virtual, and recording. In our case, I believe in 2022, all of ours were conducted remotely. So Detroit Disability Power trained their volunteers, and the Carter Center trained our volunteers. Just due to the timeline, we did not have a combined training, which is something we will probably be doing differently in the future. But for the Carter Center, we did have a 60-minute virtual training that is a PowerPoint presentation, and we went through a couple key principles. So the code of conduct, and what poll workers, what rules not poll workers, but observers needed to follow in the polling place, and then systematic approach to reporting on election administration. We can go to the next slide. So whenever it came to our actual 60-minute, ended up being more like 70-minute presentation to the observers, our training materials covered the legal framework for voting accessibility at the federal and state levels. Again, this is something where we did have people who are not as familiar with voting and disability who are on there. So we needed to go cover the essentials of, the Voting Rights Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, and other legislation that governs the accessibility of polling places. So they had the legal context for it. We went through the accessibility checklist or the audit questionnaire. So we did go through in depth, going through each question and explaining what they needed to look for, what the question was asking, and what they needed to observe. One thing that we found very helpful is that the DOJ has a checklist for polling place accessibility that is supposed to be used by election officials and is in many cases used by election officials who are auditing whether a site is going to be accessible for voting. And they have a lot of very useful graphics that are created, including diagrams of polling places, looking at specific aspects of accessibility, like showing what an accessible parking space looks like, or signage that goes into that leads to the accessible entrance. So that was really helpful, and it allowed us to give some visuals for the observers on what they needed to look at. Another thing that we had that was useful was pictures of the voter access terminals, the accessible voting machines that were used in those precincts, so they knew what to look for and what to look for in terms of making sure that there was an accessible controller and headphones. So having some sort of training where you have not just the information that is written out or that is in the survey written out, but having some sort of visual graphics that can help them to understand and conceptualize that is really helpful. We did have a code of conduct. This is not something that is required by the state, but it was something that was required by our organization to ensure that the observers were behaving in an appropriate manner. Obviously, we don't want anyone who is misbehaving in a polling place, because that can be problems not just for the organization, but for that person. So making sure that they knew what they needed to do in terms of being an objective observer, a nonpartisan, ensuring that they did not wear any sort of clothing with graphics that were about voting or had political messages on it. And then also some important information about how they needed to interact in the polling place. They should not under any circumstances speak to a voter, for example. If they were approached by media, they should inform the team that they were approached, but they should say no comment to the media. So making sure that they were behaving appropriately, making sure that when they go into the polling place, they were seeking out the polling place chairperson to introduce themselves and talk about, why they were there, and ensure that they, the polling place knew that they were there and observing. And then we just gave some additional information on who to contact in case of emergency. It's very important for them to reach out to us. If they had questions, one of our observers was denied access to the polling place, unfortunately. So making sure that they knew that had happened, so that we could follow up on that. And making sure that they knew the schedule, what time to arrive, how to check in and check out, how to move through the checklist, and ensure that they were hitting all of the questions and then moving on to the next polling place. Next slide. So in terms of our timeline for recruitment and training, about 3 weeks before Election Day, October 14th to 21st, we did outreach to the state and local disability organizations and in-person visits to Voting Rights and Election Law Society at Wayne State Law School, while Detroit Disability Power did targeted outreach to the volunteers in their community and that they have worked with previously. And then in the week before Election Day, we did a live training, by in-person live remote training actually for the Carter Center. So we did it over Zoom, and then we disseminated the recording as well. And then there was a one-on-one training with DESA for the DDP volunteers. So we did kind of have that split training model just due to the time frame last year, but that's probably something that we'll try to make sure is more integrated and cohesive so that we are sure that everyone has the same information. Next slide. So for steps 1 to 3, as I had mentioned before, you want to start at least 3 months before the November election so that you can gather all of the information on how to seek authorization, what level of observation is able to be conducted in your state, and what the timeline or what the deadlines are for seeking authorization for observation. You want to budget 1 to 2 weeks before the election for training. You could do it before that, but it's also something where you want it to be relatively fresh in people's minds. So not something where they're getting it, a month or 2 months beforehand, and then they have several weeks before they're using that information. That is just to make sure that they are able to recall everything. So we did it a couple days before the election. I think we did the Friday before the election for our training, and Detroit Disability Power, it was around the same time. You want to maintain a tracking sheet of volunteers and how they were recruited, so you can kind of draw from that information in the future, especially once you're doing kind of an analysis of what worked, thinking about replicating the audit as well. And then you want to document your process. So internal checklists are useful. Whenever it came to authorization, it became really helpful to have that tracking spreadsheet where we were able to keep track of the deadlines and when different clerks were contacted, but just keeping documentation so that whenever you go back afterwards, you can think about what did work, what needs to change for the future, and just having a detailed history of what steps you took to pull off this audit. Okay, next slide. And we'll hand it over to Leah.
Thank you, Sarah. This is my favorite part, collecting and preparing data for analysis. The great folks at Detroit Disability Power put together the checklist that Sarah talked about. That's basically a survey questionnaire, the instrument, which was programmed into Google Forms so that it can be accessible. Volunteers were using their mobile devices to enter the information, so they didn't have to enter information on a piece of paper. And Google Forms also allowed for an easy data export for us to look at the data and analyze it. The most basic format that we're using, which is useful for brief comparisons, but also for data analysis, the Google Forms produces a CSV file, which includes precinct and polling place level data. So every observation is a polling place. And we obtained information based on what volunteers reported as the survey was programmed, when they arrived at the polling place and when they left, the name of the polling place, so that we can match to our records based on the sheet that we had on who is assigned where. And of course, the series of checklist items. There were about 20 questions from the outside of the polling place, the path towards the entrance, whether the entrance was accessible or not, how it could be opened, the path towards the polling place, the check-in process, the technology used. And we also incorporated open-ended responses because experiences can be very, very different, but that was a good way to also identify potential issues with the questions themselves, any difference in interpretation of the questions, and of course, unique experiences that we cannot capture with those questions themselves. And exporting the data is very straightforward, and we aim to produce a training video for that, where we go into more depth on how the export is done and what kind of data we see after we complete the data collection through the Google Forms. Something that was very interesting for us to use and add to that data set was the type of location. So a lot of research and a lot of information about what types of buildings might be more challenging to incorporate accessibility features, and so that we can understand and what changes need to be made if changing locations is an option. And we know that this is very challenging for election officials to find a space, particularly when it comes to emergencies and relocations. But this is important information to think about what type of buildings, for example, are associated with higher accessibility features and which ones are not. Of course, jurisdiction demographics, we merged this data set with information about disability demographics, voting demographics, and that helps us a little bit understand whether there is any relationship between the type of voters that are being serviced, specifically from the disability community, and whether those needs are potentially met. Of course, those are very aggregate relationships. There's much more information that needs to be uncovered, but on the surface, it helps understand at the aggregate level whether those relationships exist or not and how to deal with them. We also other measures to add for more sophisticated analysis, but also to understand one of the big questions is, of course, how do we promote and encourage and facilitate higher participation rates among this community, both in person and by mail. This is another thing that we want to think about on how to incorporate observation of these processes. At voter turnout. This is directly connected to whether these data are available. We know that election officials and the voter registration process does not record someone's disability status. So of course, all of these data have to be collected through different means, and that's why we utilize aggregate data to better understand those relationships. But in terms of collecting the data, what we need absolutely is the information on which location was observed, what time this location was observed, because there are different times when there are a lot of people crowding a polling place. Let's say in the morning, the rush hour, and in the afternoon, it might be less busy. This is useful information for us to understand as well. And the checking list itself, we also tracked whether there were individuals who were denied access, as Sarah said before. They were able to write in the open-ended responses why they were denied access. This is important information for us because we connect it to a specific location as well, but also we track those experiences of the volunteers. We can go to the next slide. This is a slide that Dessa showed in the first panel. It's the most simplified version of the checklist where we made it pretty, and I just found the typo. We edited it so many times, and we proofread it, and still there are typos, and I apologize for that. We condensed all the questions into 3 key measures: fully accessible parking and pathway, 2 questions capturing that dimension, fully accessible entrance, 4 questions capturing that measure, and 4 questions about the voting technology that we wanted to understand. So we took a very, I don't want to call it strict, but it was a very specific approach to how we coded and evaluate the data. Any voter should have equal access to the voting process. So it's not a matter of, yes, there was a door, but it was semi-open and I had to push it. We don't consider that accessible. So we take a very specific approach to how we interpret this data and what they mean. So very simply, there were yes or no questions. Was there a clearly marked accessible parking spot, yes or no? If the answer is yes, then we consider it an accessible feature. The path from the parking space to the building entrance, talking about accessibility of the entrance itself, whether there was an accessible entrance at the main door, the same entrance that all voters were using, was it a separate entrance? We're making revisions to the questionnaire to make this, to capture these differences a little bit more clearly. Was the wheelchair accessible entrance unlocked? Yes, maybe there is one, but what's the point if the voter cannot access it, cannot enter? How the doors were operating, were they both activated, whether they were light enough to open with one hand. Some volunteers reported that there was an accessible, an entrance marked as accessible, and there was a door that was open, but there was a trash can propping the door open. So obviously this is something that would not considered as accessible. Fully accessible EAC, the machine available, set up and ready to use. It was plugged in, having the headphones. So all those features that facilitate access to the voting process and the ability of any type of voter who's using this technology to actually cast a ballot without needing assistance or asking for it. And of course, very, very importantly, voters have the right to privacy and voting independently, and the voting process should reflect that. So we tried to capture that as well in the checklist. The voting booth itself for hand-marked paper ballots. Was a wheelchair height voting booth accessible? Yes or no? Was the wheelchair height voting booth placed to ensure the voter could mark their paper ballot with secrecy? So thematically, we have three main measures. We created an index, meaning that every yes was added up, and we created an aggregate measure, which we call fully accessible. I guess there are four measures, I apologize, four measures that we aggregated into one master measure, fully accessible location, yes or no. So it is a score. It ranges from 0, where every item on the checklist is a 0. And again, 0 in our case means that those observations, those polling locations that were observed, we do not include zeros in those that were not, where our volunteers were not able to enter the location and observe. That would be problematic for analysis. And then the perfect score, I guess, would be 12, where all the checkboxes are marked. And then this is what we would consider a fully accessible polling location. We can go to the next slide. So the data collection, we spent a significant amount of time looking at the spreadsheet itself, understanding the data that we see, looking into the responses, the open-ended responses that volunteers provided to bring context into the data. Numbers themselves are not enough. We need context to understand it better, how to improve the survey, but also what are the circumstances under which those volunteers observe those polling places and what challenges they might have encountered. DDP did an enormous amount of effort to present the findings and share the findings with election clerks before the public report was disseminated. That was an opportunity to connect with them and say, this is what we found. And of course, to build a partnership, because the intention is not to litigate. This is a way to support the election community, but also raise awareness about challenges that might be remedied with simple solutions, as Dessa and Kenya talked about. There was a big report disseminated that talked about accessibility, the measure, the findings in Michigan, that the Carter Center was a collaborator. And something that we're working right now is we are producing city-specific summaries where we have a summary of the survey, what what process we use to code it, so what values we are assigning and what your score means, and then an item-by-item score by precinct, and identifying those that, let's say, are falling below and not unacceptable, because other than 12, nothing is acceptable, but some areas that might be more problematic, specifically in the context of the location itself and the type of the facility itself. So the big report that was out, improving voting accessibility for Detroit voters with disabilities, and something that the DTP and we are trying to do also is we're trying to hold workshops with clerks, with community partners. There's one that is coming up, and we will be talking about it pretty soon, where the intention is to share findings, share the process, and build partnerships and capacity, because we want to work with other organizations as well, similar to the DTP, to replicate this process and expand the reach and observation, and hopefully get a better understanding of what is happening on the ground, what are the gaps, what are the voters' needs, and whether they are met or not, and identify what solutions we can put together to improve the voter experience moving forward. We can go to the next slide. So this is something that Sarah can chime in as well. This is a learning experience as well. Every election is different. The electorate is different as well. The needs are different, and we adapt. But at the same time, there is a balance between adapting and improving, but also containing some of the features for consistency over time. Something that we learned from the Michigan audit, that there was some ambiguity in the question and what we wanted to measure. So there were interpretation differences in the volunteers, despite the fact that we did the training. That is a signal for us that, yes, we have to improve the training and revise it, but also perhaps it is time to revise the questionnaire itself to make sure we capture what we want to capture. One of the changes that we're considering making the new checklist is what I mentioned before in terms of the accessing the polling place, whether it's a main entrance or a side back entrance. So we scored the side back entrance a little bit lower than the main entrance, because although it is an entrance to the polling place, it would be great for all voters to be entering the same, whether their experience entering the building is separate but equal, if you want to call it that way. So we're rephrasing the question in the next iteration about whether the entrance to the voting area is the same for all voters, or was there a separate wheelchair accessible entrance? And we're measuring that in a different way. Again, though this change might seem very basic or not major, but it does matter and make a difference when it comes to interpretation and how volunteers might see it and how they might answer the specific question, and that directly affects whether that item is going to receive a 0 or 1, which will then affect the aggregate measure, right? And of course, that is important. We can go to the next slide. Oh yeah, or Sarah, if you want to add something, yes.
Yeah, that's certainly one of them, because we did have people who, the main entrance to the polling place was not the main entrance to the building, and that added further confusion, because are you talking about a side or back entrance to the building, or side or back entrance to the voting area? So it became really confusing just in thinking of how the individual buildings were operating, especially in places where the main entrance to the building was not the main entrance to the voting area. Some other questions that we had some ambiguity, and that can be addressed through both changes to the checklist and changes to how we train on the checklist. In the parking question, we talked about how an accessible parking spot has an access aisle, the colored lines, and the signage. But that is not all applicable whenever there's street parking. There's not going to be an access aisle for street parking. So, little things like that you might not think of being an issue, but it can be. Another one was where we had a 2-part question. Was the door either able to be opened via an accessible button, or was it light enough to open with one hand? And there were actually a lot of issues with that. The first thing being that people would look only at the first part of the question and only marked whether it was able to be opened with a button. We also didn't really have it set up in a way where they could mark, it's the button, or it's able to be opened with one hand. So, knowing what the breakdown was of one versus the other. And then another issue was that many places had doors that were propped open with a garbage can or something very large, where someone could not get into the polling place as a wheelchair user. And so we did not have, they would put that in the additional context section, but we've changed the question to now account for that, where there's an obstruction to the doorway, and making it a little bit clearer that is an option that they can choose, since that came up on several occasions. And then I think the only other thing I would mention is, I had mentioned that not all states allow the same level of observation that we did here. So this is something where the checklist could be adapted, where those interior sections could be taken out, but there's also differences in voting processes. There are still a few jurisdictions where there are not, everyone votes on an accessible voting system, and there aren't really any paper ballot voting stations. That's something where, if that is a jurisdiction that is being observed, you would have to take out the wheelchair height voting booths for marking paper ballots, those questions, because it would not be applicable. Okay, next slide.
You can take it, Sarah.
So in terms of what our next steps are, this is something where we are planning to do these audits in 2024, but we're also working as a coalition with Detroit Disability Power and with other organizations to find others who are interested in doing this in their states. So we are circulating a link if you want to sign up and receive more information on how you can conduct accessibility audits in your area. We will put that in the chat, hopefully, because I'm not going to just read it out here, but we'll circulate that link. And then this was mentioned earlier. Detroit Disability Power is hosting a workshop on the 25th, Monday, September 25th. It is a 90-minute workshop with an optional 30-minute Q&A that is going to go into more detail about how to do these audits, going through some of the information that we went through here, but also talking about what it looks like on election day and giving you the tools to be able to conduct these in your states. So that is a great opportunity if you are able to attend, if you're interested in doing this, to learn a little bit more in depth about what the process is, how your organization can do it, how it can find financial support for it as well, what grant opportunities are out there and available. And yeah, we hope to see you there. I think that next slide.
I don't think there's a next slide. I
Oh,
think
there's no next slide. Let's see as well if we can get that that hyperlink in the chat. But if anyone has questions, please submit them through the Q&A. Give it maybe like a minute or two more to see if anyone puts any questions in. I know that was a lot of information to throw at people, so. Okay, well, we'll see if any come up, but I think that if there are no questions, we'll be able to end a couple minutes early. But thank you for taking the time to come listen today. Thank you to all of the panelists for session 2, to our partners at Detroit Disability Power as well for their work on this. And we really hope that you will take an opportunity to learn more about how you can conduct these polling site surveys. And, you know, join us on the 25th as well. I did see a question here. Did we study if the handrails have the bottom pipe to keep wheelchairs from going under the rail? We didn't get into that granular of detail. We did have questions on was the pathway accessible more broadly, but you know, I was looking at things like, were there things obstructing the pathway, low-hanging branches, signs, was the ramp to the, if there was a ramp to the building, first thing, was there a ramp? Was it actually accessible? In Detroit, we came across several times where there was a ramp, but it wasn't actually accessible. It was crumbling. It could not be navigated by a wheelchair user. So we did not get into really granular details about some of these things. Another example I'll include is, you know, the type of handle for opening a door. That's something where there are specific handles that are more accessible, and then there are ones that are less accessible, where maybe future iterations of the survey and training can get a little bit more into that kind of detail. But for 2022, we weren't able to capture that. Oh, we did get a question. Okay. Do you think your presence or knowledge of your audit improved accessibility at all? So that's something where we're still in the process. It's still a work in progress because we're still in the stages right now of reaching out to election officials and meeting with those county clerks. So you know, the report was just published this year, a few months ago. I believe it was in July. We took a good 6 or more months to be able to pull that data together. And so it's something where hopefully we will see some changes by the 2024 election. And that is something where replicating the audit can be very important, because we can look at the future measures at this point. We can look at the measures for the 2024 election and site by site evaluate how it compares to 2022. And then we'll actually be able to see if there is a, you know, a change in some of these issues. But I think an important part of that is we're just getting started in this work, reaching out to election officials, trying to bring these issues to light, see if they can make some changes, especially those changes in polling places where there was only one issue, or it's an issue of poll worker training on, for example, having the signage put in the proper place, or making sure that a voting booth is in a private area. So hopefully we can make some of those changes the infrastructural challenges will still be there about the overall accessibility of the sites, particularly in Detroit. There were some challenges with certain types of buildings being less accessible or having not inaccessible walkways outside of the polling place that are going to be more of a physical infrastructure issue, but hopefully we will see some changes across the board by 2024. And I think that's the last question. But again, the sign up link is in the chat for more information on conducting accessibility audits. And as well, please hope to see you on the 25th for our longer workshop on training the trainer about how to do this for 2024. And thank you so much for everyone taking the time today to come out and listen to us. Leah, anything to add before we close out?
No, thank you, everyone. I like Judd's question, and it is a detail. This is a great opportunity to take a descriptive approach and actually catalog what is in a polling place and what isn't. At the same time, it's a challenge to how much time observers can be there without obstructing, but also how much detail can we go and what we can capture and what we can't. But it's a great opportunity to also evaluate. And as we're expanding to more places, these are items and features that we can really, really capture that no other data collection efforts or other measures or other surveys can capture. So it's a great opportunity to think a little bit more about what we can do with these processes. But of course, the primary reason is to understand the overall accessibility challenges. So thank you, Judd, so much for raising this.
Well, I think with that, we are concluded for today. Thank you, everyone, again, for coming out. And yeah, happy Disability Voting Rights Week.
Thank you, everyone.